This is a story about missteps, quirks of fate, and coincidences that cost humanity millions of lives, empires, cities, and sometimes saved generations. Fact 1. In the spring of 1923, Adolf Hitler missed his train. He was supposed to travel to Passau for an important meeting with right-wing allies. But due to confusion with the schedule, he arrived at the station 20 minutes late. It might seem like no big deal, as there were many trains. However, this particular route turned out to be fateful. The carriage he was meant to board derailed, and several passengers died. This incident, although not publicized, later became a source of superstition among Hitler's circle. The Führer is protected by fate. But looking deeper, it becomes clear how an illusion of chosenness can arise from a minor random glitch. What's more interesting is that the missed meeting altered the preparation timeline for the beer hall putsch. Planned steps had to be postponed, and this delay unexpectedly worked in favor of the future Nazis. The police were no longer watching them as closely, believing the rebellion had lost steam. One scheduling mistake gave breathing room to a conspiracy that would lead to the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century. Fact 2. In November 1962, on the submarine B-59, Soviet officer Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize the launch of a torpedo with a nuclear warhead. The reason was a communication failure. The submarine had been unable to contact Moscow for a full day. American destroyers were attacking it with practice depth charges, and Captain Savitsky decided that war had begun. According to protocol, the decision to launch nuclear weapons required the agreement of 3 people: the commander, the political officer, and the deputy, Arkhipov. 2 said yes. Arkhipov said no. The reason for his refusal was that he had not seen a direct order and, in his words, "It's too quiet upstairs for nuclear war." Only in the 90s did the world learn how close it had come to the apocalypse. Everything depended on a person who felt superfluous and held a lower rank than the other 2. One voice, a random line of reasoning, and faith in intuition outweighed the entire strategic nuclear arsenal. Fact 3. A single broken lighter changed Fidel Castro's fate. In August 1956, he was preparing for the assault on the Moncada barracks, the first armed action of his movement. The truck driver, who was supposed to give the signal to start the attack, was meant to strike a lighter. This was the agreed-upon signal. But the lighter failed. In the darkness, full of tension, the signal was not given. Some fighters did not react, and others began to act chaotically. As a result, the operation failed, and dozens were killed or captured. Castro survived by a miracle and later found himself in prison. It was this failure, caused by a completely mundane malfunction, that later became his political capital. The "history will absolve me" trial turned him into a national symbol of resistance. What was supposed to be a failure and an end turned into a beginning because of one inoperative lighter. Fact 4. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand arrived in Sarajevo in June 1914, things did not go according to plan. Several assassination attempts failed. Bombs did not detonate, and shots missed their mark. Annoyed and tired, he decided to change his route and go to the hospital to visit the injured. However, the driver did not know the new route. Turning the wrong way, the motorcade accidentally drove onto Franz Joseph Street, where Gavrilo Princip, one of the conspirators who had decided to grab a bite and no longer expected success, stood bewildered outside a coffee shop. Princip wasn't even hiding. He simply stepped out, saw the car with the intended person sitting inside, and fired twice. The death of the heir to the throne caused a domino effect, triggering World War I. All of this was the result of a wrong turn, the driver's lack of a radio, and a cheese sandwich that kept Princip from leaving. Fact 5. In 1943, the American Army was developing a secret operation to capture the Italian island of Pantelleria. To divert the enemy's attention from the real landing, British intelligence proposed a remarkably simple trick: to dump a corpse with forged documents off the coast of Spain. The operation was codenamed Operation Mincemeat. For it, the body of a homeless man who had died from poisoning was used. He was given a new identity, Major William Martin, an officer of the Royal Navy, allegedly transporting invasion plans for Greece. These papers, deliberately poorly hidden in a diplomatic briefcase, fell into the hands of the Nazis through sympathetic Spanish officials. The German command believed it. As a result, the main forces of the Wehrmacht were redeployed to the Balkans, and the actual landing in Sicily proceeded with minimal losses. One nameless person, coincidentally fitting the anatomical profile, became the key to a crucial turning point in the Mediterranean campaign. And if the Spanish pathologist had been a little more attentive, the ruse could have failed. Fact 6. In 1917, the revolutionary ship Aurora nearly broke free from its anchor due to a faulty Kingston valve, a system for flooding the holds. A technical malfunction almost forced the crew to evacuate. However, engineers managed to plug the leak with improvised means. A few days later, it was this very ship that fired a blank shot which served as the signal for the storming of the Winter Palace. The gun itself was symbolic. There was no live ammunition, and the sailors were uncertain about the seriousness of the situation. But the shot was fired because the Aurora was still in port. If the Kingston valve had not complied and the ship had gone for repairs, the signal would not have sounded, and the assault might have failed or been delayed. A technical service element played a part in the political theater. The irony is that the ship's commander, Nikolai Kolomaitsev, would later say, "We ourselves did not fully understand what we had started then." Fact 7. Henry VIII, the individual who initiated the religious revolution in England, arrived at this turning point through a simple infatuation. He pursued Anne Boleyn, but the Pope refused to grant permission for a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Negotiations went on for years. Then, one day in 1531, the papal envoy got stuck on a country road. The axle of his carriage broke. This delayed another meeting with the king. An irritated Henry, in a rage, signed a document that first mentioned the Church of England as independent from Rome. The document was intended as a form of pressure. But a couple of months later, when passion subsided, it was no longer possible to restore the relationship. The chain of decisions moved forward by inertia. One diplomat who didn't arrive on time marked the beginning of the era of Anglicanism, executions, monastic expropriations, and a new balance of power in Europe. Fact number 8. In the autumn of 1944, in the Ardennes forests, a German radio operator failed to switch his radio frequency due to frozen fingers. He transmitted a coded message on an old channel, and it was intercepted by Allied intelligence. The message contained information about unusual activity behind the Wehrmacht's lines. Large columns were moving towards the front, even though a period of calm was officially declared. The intercepted data allowed the U.S. command to understand that an offensive was being prepared. In 2 days, the Ardennes offensive would begin, the Third Reich's last major attack in the West. Prepared troops met the enemy differently than if the blow had been sudden. Historians debate how critical this coded message was. However, the operator himself wrote in his memoirs 20 years later, "My hand wouldn't obey, it was too cold to press accurately." One moment of physical weakness in the December snow, and the entire configuration of the battle shifted. Fact 9. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich with a paper bearing Adolf Hitler's signature. He declared from the podium, "I have brought peace for our time." And this piece of paper, which could have become a historical anecdote, literally did. But if not for one episode, everything might have gone differently. The day before the trip, Hitler almost canceled the meeting. He had a fever. Doctors suspected tonsillitis. Scribes at headquarters insisted on postponing the reception of the British delegation. But the Führer himself, irritated and stubborn, stated that he did not want to appear weak. He received Chamberlain in a semi-basement room surrounded by scarves. The negotiations proceeded in a strange atmosphere. One coughed, the other nodded along. This sudden illness prevented the careful coordination of details. And instead of categorical formulations about Czechoslovakia's borders, vague promises were included in the protocol. This later allowed the agreement to be interpreted as betrayal rather than arrangement. The high fever and the politician's stubbornness, that was the thin thread on which the attempt to stop the catastrophe hung. Fact 10. In 1865, actor John Wilkes Booth was traveling by train from Washington to Richmond. He was not supposed to be on that particular car. He obtained his ticket through a chance exchange with a friend. During the journey, he overheard a conversation between two military men discussing Abraham Lincoln's potential visit to Ford's Theater the following Friday. These words served as a spark. Booth already held radical views, but the decision-making point occurred precisely during this trip. He found himself in the right place to acquire the necessary information. Within a couple of days, he began preparing the assassination, acquiring a pistol and a knife, and planning his escape route. The entire chain of events, from the choice of theater to the moment of the shot, was set in motion by a random transfer to a train. While Booth's ideas did not originate there, it was this coincidence that gave them the form of action. The president, who did not alter his plans, and the actor, who ended up in the wrong car, shifted the political axis of the United States. Fact 11. During the Russo-Japanese War, a single telegram sent with an error altered the course of the entire Tsushima operation. In April 1905, Admiral Rojesvinsky was expecting reinforcements from Allied ships and requested clarification of the enemy fleet's coordinates. A contracted telegraph operator in Shanghai mistakenly provided a longitude with transposed digits, 73 instead of 37. For several hours, the squadron proceeded in the wrong direction, ended up in a disadvantageous position, and, in conditions of complete fog, missed the opportunity to attack the Japanese ships before their regrouping. It might seem like a digit is just a technical detail. However, in naval warfare, where precision is paramount, such a minor thing can mean a shift in the front line by tens of kilometers. The squadron became disoriented, signalmen lost each other in the fog, and the Japanese seized the initiative. The Battle of Tsushima became a catastrophe, and it all began with one human error, not on the deck, but at the telegraph key in a distant Asian office. Fact 12. In 1921, in Prague, students from the chemistry faculty accidentally developed a substance that would later be named sarin. The experiments were part of research for new pesticides, and one sample proved particularly volatile. A lab technician who inhaled its vapors lost consciousness. The reaction was deemed interesting and recorded in a report. This report, 2 years later, fell into the hands of German industrialists collaborating with military structures. This marked the beginning of a development chain that led to the creation of new generation chemical warfare agents. Crucially, the very first report ended up in the Bayer archive solely because another report was misdirected during shipping. Documentation concerning fertilizers was sent to the Military Materials Department. Had the envelopes not been mixed up, sarin might have remained a laboratory curiosity. The entire course of modern chemical warfare could have taken a different path. One folder, one archival glitch, and a chain of deadly decisions began to spin. Fact 13. In 1898, French writer Émile Zola sent an open letter titled J'accuse to President Félix Faure, advocating for Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew convicted of espionage. However, the letter might not have reached its destination. A typesetter at the Love printing house accidentally swapped pages, inserting Zola's article into the morning edition when it was initially planned for the evening release. Ministers and deputies read the newspaper during breakfast. This timing created a bombshell effect, with parliamentarians calling editorial offices and sparking public outrage at the peak of daily political activity. Had the article been published in the evening, it would not have been discussed during the session. The printing error gave the letter political weight. Dreyfus himself was on Devil's Island at the time and knew nothing of this. The course of his case was altered by a random editorial oversight that turned a personal protest into a historical process. Fact 14. In 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy visited Dallas despite Security Service recommendations to cancel the trip. The reason was a conflict between his team and local politicians. Refusing the visit would have been considered an insult. However, the motorcade route was approved in haste. Initially, it was supposed to go along the wide Main Street, but road services had not finished repairs, so the route was moved to Elm Street, a narrow section with a 90-degree turn. This slowed down the movement, and at that moment, the motorcade came into direct view of the warehouse window from which Lee Harvey Oswald shot. Professionals still debate whether a shot was possible at speed. Most likely, no. But it was the route change that gave the assassin a chance. A bureaucratic snag in the road service, one unsigned street acceptance document, and the history of the United States went down a different branch. Fact 15. In July of 1942, in the village of Osofsy near Brest, the evacuation of the civilian population was carried out. The command of the Red Army planned to mine the bridge over the Bug River to delay the advance of the Wehrmacht. One of the sappers, Sergeant Dvornikov, mistakenly placed the charge not on the central support but closer to the bank. His colleagues corrected the scheme but forgot to remove the old detonator. When a column of German tanks crossed the bridge in the morning, both devices were triggered, causing a chain reaction. In addition to the bridge itself, a pontoon crossing and an ammunition depot on the opposite bank were destroyed. This explosion destroyed the command post of the division that was preparing to storm Brest. What was an engineering error led to the complete disorganization of the offensive for 3 days. Historians later analyzed this, noting that without this delay, German units could have connected with the southern flank of Army Group Center, and the outcome of the offensive on the Eastern Front would have been different. Fact 16. In 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, a French soldier was digging a trench near the fortress of Rashid. His shovel struck a stone. It turned out to be a black basalt block with 3 inscriptions: hieroglyphs, Demotic script, and ancient Greek. The unit commander decided the stone might be of interest to scholars and sent it to Cairo. This is how the Rosetta Stone was found, the key to deciphering ancient Egyptian writing. But the most curious thing is that the day before, the soldier had been assigned to kitchen duty, and he only swapped shifts with a comrade at the last moment. Had he not been at that particular spot, the stone could have lain in the sand for decades more. Furthermore, the British almost destroyed it in Alexandria, mistaking it for part of the fortifications. What saved it were the Greek letters on the block. One lieutenant recognized the alphabet. A chance change of guard and a basic knowledge of the language saved an artifact that changed historical science. Fact 17. In the year 1860, U.S. presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln gained a significant political advantage due to a typesetter's technical error. One of his speeches in Illinois was initially planned as a standard campaign address, but his aides decided to send its text to Midwestern newspapers. The problem was a rather bland phrase in one paragraph about the moral ambiguity of slavery. The typesetter misplaced a dash and a comma, resulting in the strong statement, "A nation cannot remain half slave and half free." This phrase electrified editorial offices. It sounded like a slogan and was immediately quoted. Lincoln himself initially didn't understand why he was being asked for explanations. Only after seeing the newspaper version did he decide to keep the wording. Thus, a typesetting error transformed into one of the main tenets of his campaign, helping to mobilize opponents of slavery. Sometimes the spirit of the age dictates its grammar through an accidental keystroke. Fact 18. During World War II, the American Army tested so-called flying tanks, light tracked vehicles that could be dropped by parachute. The project was called Half Nelson and was essentially doomed from the start. The equipment broke upon landing, the trajectory was uncontrollable, and paratroopers often couldn't find the tanks after they landed. However, one day, one of these tanks went off course and crashed near a German column in France. The blast wave destroyed 2 trucks carrying ammunition. The Germans mistook this for the start of a major airborne landing and began to retreat, abandoning a fortified village that the Allies had been unable to capture. This allowed for a rapid breakthrough and consolidation on a sector where a breach of the Siegfried Line was planned. Later, this incident was described as a lucky accident. Tanks were no longer dropped, and the project was closed. But one malfunction, caused by an incorrect wind calculation, provided the Army with a foothold at the cost of 1 piece of scrap metal and an empty cabin. Fact 19. In 1991, a coup in Moscow almost failed due to a factory vehicle malfunction. As troops were entering the city, a tank battalion from a factory in Lublino was supposed to drive onto Red Square. One of the tractors, at the end of the column, stalled at a turn near Novokuznetskaya Street, blocking the path of the others. Command was in disarray. It was impossible to bypass due to blocked arches, and an evacuation truck could not be found. As a result, the equipment stood idle for almost an hour and a half, and the signal for seizure of communications was postponed. During this period, hundreds of people managed to gather at the White House, and the radio station Echo of Moscow was still broadcasting. There was enough time to form civilian resistance, block roads, and begin the night defense. The stalled engine of a Soviet military tractor played a role in the collapse of the coup attempt. Later, the driver said in an interview, "The fuel pump just froze. We in the Army are used to that." But this time, the equipment's habit of breaking down changed the course of the entire country. Fact 20. In 1986, during preparations for the Challenger launch, engineers from Morton Thiokol, the company responsible for the solid rocket boosters, warned NASA about risks associated with low temperatures. However, their facts ended up in a pile of documents marked urgent and was simply overlooked until the morning meeting. Furthermore, due to the absence of an electronic registry, no one tracked who read the paper and when. The temperature on launch day dropped below freezing, causing the rubber O-rings to harden. During liftoff, a gas leak occurred. 73 seconds after launch, the shuttle exploded. All 7 astronauts perished. Yet, the tragedy could have been postponed. Had the facts been delivered personally, the launch would have been canceled. One document, one missed call, and a catastrophe ensued. It was a coincidence bordering on negligence, a technical oversight, but fundamentally, the paper ended up in the wrong pile. Sometimes, fate is determined not by what is known, but by when and to whom it falls into the hands. Fact 21st. In 1906, during the San Francisco earthquake, one of the first fires started not because of building collapses, but due to an attempt to make coffee. A man, not waiting for the gas to be restored, decided to use a spirit lamp. The flame caught a fallen tablecloth, the fire spread to a wooden cabinet, and from there to the wall. It seemed like an ordinary domestic incident. However, it was from this apartment that the flame spread to Green Street and then towards the city center. In the chaos, no one could quickly stop its spread. Moreover, the military, trying to create a firebreak, blew up several buildings with dynamite, and the shockwave only accelerated the fire's spread. The city burned for 3 days, over 3,000 people died, and the center was almost completely destroyed. And it all began with an attempt to brew coffee in a damaged house. Sometimes, adherence to a morning ritual in an extreme situation triggers a process that can no longer be stopped. Fact 22nd. In 1916, in Flanders, a German officer named Oskar von Wasmund stepped on a metal can while inspecting a trench. Mistaking it for a discarded mine, he recoiled, slipped, and sprained his ankle. The following day, he was transferred to the infirmary and replaced by another commander. This new officer, unaware of the defense's intricacies, left an open flank that was considered secure. 2 days later, Allied forces conducted a reconnaissance in force and stumbled upon this section. They breached the defensive line and occupied an advantageous position, marking the beginning of a successful offensive in this sector of the front. The accidental sprain, caused by an empty can, turned out to be the weak link in the German chain. Wasmund himself later wrote in his diary, "I left for a day and everything fell apart. I hope it was a sardine can, not fate." A military machine can be flawless, but even it depends on trifles, like rusty tin. Fact 23rd. In the autumn of 1905 in Petersburg, the writer Leonid Andreev was sending the proofs for his novella Judas Iscariot to the printing house. At the printing house, the boxes with papers were mixed up, and by mistake, not his manuscript, but the manuscript of a young author previously left unanswered was sent. Thus, Alexander Kuprin's novella, The Garnet Bracelet, saw the light for the first time. The printing was already underway when the error was noticed, but Andreev, upon seeing the accidental publication, was delighted and asked to leave everything as it was. The novella, not intended for release, ultimately became a gem of Russian prose of the Silver Age. Kuprin later recalled that he had already lost hope, and the letter of approval came to him on the day he was about to give up his literary career. The typographical confusion, which occurred because the warehouse keeper had his birthday and was rushing home, changed two destinies at once. One career began, the other gained respect. An error for which no one was ever fired. Fact 24th. In 1937, during the construction of the Silo Heights in Germany, a land surveyor named Krauss made an error in the ground-level elevations. He transferred figures from a summer survey to a winter plan without adjustment for seasonal soil swelling. This created a false impression of the plateau's height, and fortifications on a key eastern front position were built a couple of meters below the optimal observation angle. In 1945, this very position became the arena for the Soviet offensive. German artillery positions, built according to the winter markings, could not fire on low-lying sectors. The Red Army advanced along the so-called blind flank, which the Wehrmacht command considered unassailable. All because of one hastily filled-out geodesic table. An error unnoticed in winter resulted in a missed attack in spring. Sometimes war is decided not on the battlefield, but at the moment someone compares figures with last year's plan and thinks, it'll do. Fact 25th. In the spring of 1942, in the Dutch city of Enschede, a German officer temporarily set up headquarters in a school library. During an inspection, he found a locked cabinet, but without a key. Believing that radio transmitters might be hidden there, he ordered it to be broken open the following day. However, during the night, a teenager from the underground infiltrated the building to retrieve his cousin's hidden diary from that very cabinet. He feared that the entries could expose hidden Jews. Subsequently, this diary became the first description of Anne Frank's fate, appearing even before the main text was published. The teenager's name was Joop van Gelder, and his name is mentioned almost nowhere. His actions not only saved part of the manuscripts, but also provided the opportunity to compare versions and confirm the authenticity of the text later on. Joop himself did not live to see the publication. He died in July of the same year. But if the cabinet had been opened in the morning, the story of the most famous young witness to the Holocaust might have disappeared before it began. Fact 26th. In July 1914, mere days before the start of World War I, Belgian railway workers initiated an indefinite strike. Their demands were strictly economic, an increase in wages and a reduction in night shifts. However, it was precisely this strike that disrupted the transfer of one of the German Reserve Corps, which was slated to move through Belgian territory during a lightning offensive. Due to a shortage of wagons and halted stations, the redeployment took twice as long as planned. Consequently, the French managed to regroup, and the Battle of the Marne resulted in the halting of the German advance. General von Moltke later wrote in a report, "It was not soldiers who hindered us, but timetables." The strike, having no connection to politics, became an element of the entire campaign's strategic failure. And although the participants themselves were unaware of the consequences, their refusal to work literally shifted the front line by hundreds of kilometers. Fact 27th. In 1829 in Boston, a young doctor named Oliver Holmes, while assisting with childbirth, mistakenly swapped containers with solutions. Instead of an antiseptic, he used a weak alcohol solution. The baby and mother survived, unlike other women who died in the same hospital from puerperal fever. This incident so struck Holmes that he began systematically studying the link between sterility and mortality. Ultimately, he became one of the first to publicly advocate for hand hygiene in obstetrics. However, the initial impetus for his scientific interest came from a random choice of a flask. He would later write in a lecture, "Knowledge came from a bottle, but not the one I intended to use." And although Holmes's theories were initially rejected, they influenced the young Joseph Lister, who in turn became the founder of antiseptic surgery. One incorrect solution on a scuffed stand in the corner of the delivery room became the prologue to a revolution in medicine. Fact 28. In 1926, at a scientific conference on quantum physics in Berlin, Albert Einstein almost missed his own presentation. The reason was mundane. His watch stopped overnight and he woke up 40 minutes late. Hurriedly dressing, he grabbed the wrong folder. Instead of the prepared text with new calculations on photon theory, he took notes on general relativity. Realizing this on the podium, Einstein decided to improvise, starting a discussion on the possible influence of gravity on the frequency of light. This fragment, presented without formulas, was understandable even to students and young physicists. Later, one of the attendees, Hermann Bondi, based on these very words, would develop a line of research that led to the concept of the cosmological horizon. Ironically, Einstein himself did not attach much importance to that speech. He later wrote to a friend, "I read the wrong text, but I think I said more." Sometimes, greatness begins with simply mixing up your bags. Fact 29th. In 1939, when World War II began, Poland still hoped for support from France and Great Britain. The government's evacuation plan included a flight from Warsaw on a Lockheed aircraft towards Romania. However, on the night before the scheduled departure, the pilot refused to take off due to weather conditions, citing engine trouble and outdated maps. In reality, he simply disliked the condition of the runway. The forced one-night delay led to a hasty change of route, and a convoy with documents and valuables sent by land was bombed. Among the lost items was the archive of Polish intelligence, containing its agent network across Europe. These documents fell into the hands of the SS. Furthermore, they helped uncover underground networks in the Netherlands and Belgium. A single refusal of a night flight driven by practical caution not only destroyed the archive but also endangered thousands of people in occupied countries. Sometimes, the fate of the underground is decided by a single weather forecast. Fact 30th. In 1896, English sailor John James Robertson was assigned to the ship Waverley. However, at the last moment, he swapped with a friend to visit his sick mother. The ship Waverley set sail, and 24 hours later collided with an iceberg off the coast of Newfoundland. Almost the entire crew perished. Robertson, who remained ashore, joined the port guard. 2 years later, he helped prevent a disaster on another ship, the Titanic. It was he who, noticing a shipment of unstable batteries in the cargo manifest, insisted on additional insulation and ensured their separate transport. Although the sinking of the Titanic in 1912 could not be prevented, a portion of the cargo that could have intensified a fire in the holds was removed thanks to Robertson's decision. One visit to his sick mother in the 90s saved a man who would later contribute to a cause unknown to anyone for a long time. The accidental choice of a voyage resulted in a complex chain of consequences, where some misfortunes led to the partial salvation of others. Fact 31. In 1905, at a reception hosted by British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, a guest, Imre Lakatos, a young Hungarian chemist, accidentally spilled wine on the politician's sleeve. To make amends, he started a conversation, mentioning new experiments on synthesizing saltpeter from air. This topic interested Balfour, and within a week, he arranged a meeting for Lakatos with representatives of the military-industrial complex. Following this meeting, it was decided to invest in laboratories, which later, through 2 levels of subcontractors, funded Fritz Haber's research. The result was the ammonia synthesis method, the basis for both fertilizers and explosives. Millions of tons of products, both peaceful and military, emerged from a chain initiated by a stain on a sleeve and an awkward remark. Without that clumsy scene, Lakatos would hardly have found himself at the center of the British scientific system. And without him, Haber himself might not have received his chance. Sometimes a drop of wine is a drop from which wars and harvests are born. Fact 32nd. In April 1999, in Belgrade, NATO aviation struck the Chinese embassy building, causing an international scandal. 3 journalists were killed and dozens were injured. The official version was an error in coordinates. This was not a lie. The coordinates were indeed taken from an outdated CIA database, where the embassy building was listed as the office of a logistics firm connected to the Serbian military. The officer processing the target used a paper atlas from '95, as the digital system was overloaded and the server had frozen. It was at this precise moment that the order was given. It later emerged that the atlas was kept in his car and already had a page torn out. He reprinted the required sector and mixed up the address. This series of mundane occurrences, a frozen server, a lost page, the fatigue of the night shift, led to a diplomatic crisis between Beijing and Washington. 1 sheet of paper, 1 button press, and a geographical point turned into a target. These are the coincidences that ignite the fires of history in the 21st century. Fact 33rd. In September 1945, Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita was sentenced to death by an American military tribunal for crimes committed by his subordinates in Manila. However, the basis for the sentence was a telegram that, according to the recollections of communications officers, Yamashita did not personally send. It was typed by the duty officer on orders from an adjutant while Yamashita was in another city. The text included the phrase, "Hold positions by all means." Prosecutors later interpreted this as an indirect indication that brutality was permissible. It was subsequently revealed that the order was a copy of an earlier directive, and the word "all" appeared only in this version due to an error, an automatic template substitution. The electromechanical typewriter used in the headquarters stored short clichés in its memory. 1 incorrect click, made with the wrong finger, equated the commander with a perpetrator of atrocities. The error in wording, which remained in the papers, predetermined the outcome of the case. Although this was discussed during the appeal, formality proved stronger than common sense. Fact 34th. During Nikita Khrushchev's visit to the UN in 1960, one of the most famous Cold War incidents occurred, the shoe banging on the podium. The official version states that Khrushchev banged his shoe in protest against the statements of the Philippine delegate. However, it is less known how the shoe ended up in his hands. In reality, Khrushchev arrived at the hall in new shoes that were rubbing his foot. He took one off under the table, and at that moment, a UN employee passing by accidentally bumped it with a cart of papers. The shoe rolled under the podium. Khrushchev, unable to find it under the table, in irritation, grabbed a spare shoe which he always carried with him after fractures in the '30s, old, soft footwear. It was with this shoe that he gestured. Thus, the symbol of the Soviet leader's aggressive image arose not as an act of deliberate provocation, but as a consequence of a blister, poor shoe fit, and the habit of carrying a standby pair. The image that entered the Chronicles was born from purely personal, everyday irritation. Fact 35th. In 1862 year, during the U.S. Civil War, telegrapher Jonathan Meade at General McClellan's headquarters accidentally switched a cable. This transmitted a coded message about plans for a Northwest offensive back to Washington instead of to its intended recipient on the front lines. The telegram was intercepted and deciphered by Southern agents, allowing the Confederate Army to prepare an ambush at South Mountain Pass. Historians still debate whether this mistake was due to fatigue, technical confusion, or carelessness. But it is known that Meade was servicing a dual communication channel for the first time that day. The error in routing the cable on the switchboard lasted only 90 seconds, but it was enough to disrupt the entire campaign's strategy. The ambush at South Mountain delayed the Union's advance by 10 days, enabling Confederate forces to regroup and avoid encirclement. The Battle of Antietam, which became the bloodiest of the entire war, might not have happened. All because of the wrong lever in the wrong hand. Fact 36. In the summer of 1985, a private dinner took place in London. Attendees included representatives of British intelligence, former diplomats, and several scientists from Oxford. The evening's topic was new risks in the Arctic. One professor, having difficulty distinguishing accents, misheard the word Russian as racist. This led him to discuss internal political movements in Britain, straying further from the agenda. His confusion caused nervous laughter, but one MI6 agent suddenly noted a phrase about growing interest in climate windows. It turned out that Soviet ships were increasingly venturing into the Arctic Ocean out of season, presumably testing navigation in new weather conditions. This fleeting comment initiated a series of analytical reports that first introduced the terms weather window and ice corridor. These later became the basis for the concept of the Northern Sea Route as a geopolitical challenge. Had the professor not misheard and gone off topic, intelligence might have missed an early signal. Sometimes, even an auditory error can mark the beginning of a new strategic doctrine. Fact 37th. In 1925, at the Krasny Putilovets plant in Leningrad, an incident occurred at the electrical panel. Due to a voltage surge, a transformer burned out, leaving the workshop assembling experimental radio transmitters without power for 24 hours. Design engineer Alexander Popov, who shared the name of the famous inventor, used the downtime to analyze interference in the signal stabilization system. Remarkably, it was during these forced hours that he developed a method for suppressing echo in wired systems, a solution that significantly increased communication range. This circuit was later used in government communication lines and exported to Eastern Europe. Popov himself admitted that he would not have analyzed the interference if the equipment had not failed. One technical accident, caused by simple overheating, resulted in a technological leap. The irony is that the transformer burned out due to an attempt to turn on a homemade heater. Heat, by taking away an hour of work, brought millions of kilometers of communication. 38th fact. In 1925, during the filming of the movie Battleship Potemkin, director Sergei Eisenstein requested a change of location for a mass scene on a staircase. The original site in Odessa had been occupied for military exercises. Instead, the second largest staircase by the Primorsky Boulevard was chosen. This forced change, agreed upon the day before filming, resulted in a shot that later became one of the most powerful visual symbols of violence and tragedy in world cinema. The specific features of the new staircase, its perspective, sharp incline, and open sky, allowed for the creation of a sense of hopelessness and dynamism. Had the filming remained at the original location, the scene might have appeared ordinary. Thus, a change of scenery, dictated by a random military schedule, gave birth to a cinematic language that influenced Coppola, Spielberg, and dozens of other directors. Sometimes, a world masterpiece is not the product of intent, but of a garrison schedule. Fact 39th. In 1961, it was not Yuri Gagarin, but German Titov who was supposed to fly into space. The entire Vostok program was being prepared in parallel for two candidates, and the choice remained uncertain until the very last moment. However, 24 hours before the launch, Titov developed a fever, a mild viral infection caught during a swimming pool training session. The medical team decided not to take any risks. Gagarin, as the backup, was urgently placed in isolation and prepared for the launch. He himself recalled that he learned about his replacement only the night before. The flight, which became a landmark for all of humanity, depended on a careless jump into cold water. Titov did fly a few months later, but in history, his name would be second. And if his immunity had not failed on the eve, the phrase, "let's go," could have belonged to a completely different person. Fact 40. During the Berlin crisis of 1961, Soviet tanks at Checkpoint Charlie and American Pershings stood facing each other, ready for a confrontation. Tension grew by the hour. Then a curious incident occurred. One of the American tank drivers misjudged the dimensions of his vehicle while maneuvering and nudged a neighboring tank, causing a screech of metal. Soviet observers interpreted the movement as preparation for an attack and began deploying their crews. Only the intervention of a translator who happened to be nearby prevented escalation. He explained it was a driver's error. Later, American protocols would refer to this episode as the mirror incident, as a side mirror had grazed the armor of another vehicle. The mechanical touch almost led to a nuclear confrontation. One wrong turn of a lever, and the chance of burning in a global inferno became frighteningly real. Fact 41. In 1797, the French envoy Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's elder brother, arrived in Rome. His objective was to negotiate the terms for the future occupation of the Papal States. Upon arrival, however, he was detained due to a malaria outbreak, as doctors insisted on a quarantine. Consequently, negotiations had to be conducted through intermediaries. One of them, the Jesuit monk Giuseppe Moretto, inserted a phrase into the documents stating the sovereignty of spiritual authority over the conscience of citizens. This passage would later become Pius VII's argument when refusing to crown Napoleon in Paris, and the reason for the famous self-coronation scene. A single feverish episode and the forced substitution of the diplomat altered the script. Instead of the traditional ceremony, France witnessed the general placing the crown on his own head. This gesture symbolized a break with the church and the beginning of a new form of power. All because of a mosquito bite and a high temperature. Fact 42. When Hitler was preparing the beer hall putsch in 1923, he was counting on the support of General Erich Ludendorff. However, on the day of the event, his car unexpectedly broke down, and he arrived at the meeting 40 minutes late. Hitler had already begun improvising, trying to keep the audience engaged when Ludendorff burst into the room, assuming everything was part of a prearranged plan. His authority helped legitimize the uprising for a short time. But this delay disrupted the entire schedule. The Pushtis column took to the streets after police patrols had already received information and regrouped. This is precisely why the clash at the Feldherrnhalle became bloody. The irony is that Ludendorff himself refused to ride a horse due to rheumatism, aggravated by an old war injury. The car, which wouldn't start that morning, became a cog in a chain of events where half an hour played the role of a death sentence.
Fact 44. In the German city of Ohrdruf, in 1945, American soldiers were the first to enter one of the hastily abandoned death camps. Their commander, General Eisenhower, arrived at the site 2 days later, shocked by the reports. During the inspection, he was offered to be photographed in front of the barracks, but the photojournalist forgot to load film into the camera. Eisenhower, irritated and shaken by what he saw, refused to pose again. Instead, he ordered an immediate convocation of a delegation of senators and journalists so that not a single scoundrel would say that this did not happen. The photograph was not taken, but it resulted in one of the Allies' sharpest propaganda actions. American newspapers were filled with eyewitness accounts, and the newsreel footage from Ohrdruf became the first official film from the camps. The photographer's mistake spurred a decision that turned a spontaneous inspection into a public accusation. The empty camera became a catalyst for the historical documentation of the Holocaust.
Fact 44. In 1909, Russian physicist Pyotr Lebedev was scheduled to present his report on the electromagnetic pressure of light at the International Congress in Budapest. However, the day before his presentation, he stepped onto his hotel balcony, slipped on wet tiles, and injured his ligaments. Due to his limp, he was unable to participate in the session and passed his text to a colleague, Hungarian scientist Zsigmond Bohr. Bohr, after delivering the speech on his own initiative, added a hypothesis at the end regarding the potential use of light pressure in systems for moving objects in a vacuum. These words, recorded by stenographers, were included in a collection where the report was already attributed to both scientists. This remark inspired the young student Hermann Oberth to create early sketches of photoelectric engines. Oberth would later become the mentor of Wernher von Braun. In other words, one rainy balcony, one sprained ankle, and one addition by someone else to another's text became the first step towards the idea of a solar sail.
Fact 45th. In the autumn of 1921, a quarantine was declared at the Baku port. This was due to a cholera outbreak among the dock workers, which led to a halt in vessel arrivals. On the same day, the research vessel Mikhail Lomonosov was scheduled to begin its voyage to the Caspian Sea to collect data on oil layers. The forced delay of 1 week allowed the crew to use their free time to investigate magnetic anomalies near Absheron, a routine task that had been postponed earlier. During this work, a series of geophysical disturbances was recorded, indicating a new type of stratum. Shortly after leaving the port, the largest oil field, later named Oil Rocks, was discovered. Had it not been for the sanitary order, the expedition would likely have missed this discovery. A simple test tube with contaminated water altered the course of the scientific vessel and the economic map of the 20th century.
Fact 46th. In 1970, the United States conducted tests on the ARPANET computer network, the precursor to the Internet. The objective was to transmit the word log in from one computer to another. Engineer Charlie Klein typed the letters L and O, but at that moment the system froze. The server crashed and the connection was interrupted. An hour and a half later, after a restart, the attempt was successful. However, it was these first 2 letters, LO, that were recorded as the first transmitted text in Internet history. The irony is that LO can be perceived as the beginning of the word look, or even as an exclamation, "Lo, start looking." Years later, this fragment became a symbol of the dawn of the digital age. The first glitch, caused by a simple buffer overload, turned out not to be a failure, but a historic start. An error that became the logo of an entire civilization. Fact 47th. In the spring of 1903 in St. Petersburg, during the preparation of an assassination attempt on the Minister of Internal Affairs, Vyacheslav Plehve, socialist revolutionary terrorists planned to use homemade grenades. However, the militants' warehouse ran out of the required type of fuses. One of the liaisons, a technologist student named Nikolai Kolyuzhin, decided to use a sample left from a previous batch, which had a slight defect in the threading. It was this defect that caused the projectile to change trajectory upon being thrown and explode under the carriage wheels instead of hitting its target, not inside the carriage. The minister died, but the coachman survived and was able to describe the location and moment from which the grenade was thrown. This allowed the police to more quickly track down the organizers. During a raid, cells were uncovered not only in the capital, but also in Kyiv, Tula, and Kazan. A single threaded protrusion on a brass casing, discarded due to a lack of time, became the thread that unraveled the entire network. The assassination attempt was successful, but the accidental angle of the explosion led to a chain of failures. Fact 48th. In 1919 in Paris, during the work on the Treaty of Versailles, the translator for the British delegation, Arthur Norton, mistranslated a phrase from the French draft. It stated, "the right of peoples to self-determination within historical borders," but he rendered it as "within the limits of possible territorial balance." At the hearings concerning the fate of the Sudetenland and the Teschen area, this wording proved decisive. The Americans supported the British interpretation. As a result, the disputed territories were transferred to Czechoslovakia, despite claims from Poland and Austria. In the years that followed, this very decision would become a constant source of tension in the region and one of Hitler's arguments for the annexation of the Sudetenland in 1938. Norton later admitted that he was in a hurry and did not check the draft. But his haste, prompted by the fact that cold roast beef was served for lunch and he had not eaten breakfast, marked the beginning of a new border, from which the avalanche of the 20th century would roll.
Fact 49th. In 1947, a mix-up occurred at London Heathrow Airport. A passenger on a flight from Karachi mistakenly received another person's luggage, a large wooden crate containing samples of smallpox viruses. These samples were being sent for research to the Institute of Tropical Medicine. The crate was opened upon arrival, and airport staff, unaware of its contents, simply placed it in the lost and found room. Several hours later, one of the workers contracted the disease, and an outbreak spread through the area. This marked the last epidemic of smallpox in Great Britain. A labeling error on the sorting belt due to a missing tag proved to be fatally significant. Following this incident, the system for labeling biological cargo was revised globally. A random suitcase, the wrong sticker, a forgotten room, and a virus survived where it was thought to be eradicated. Fact 50. During World War II, in the Italian village of Montecatini, a local blacksmith named Giulio Perini accidentally bit through a communication cable. He believed it was discarded and inactive, as it was obstructing the passage of a cart. In reality, it was a backup communication line between the German division's headquarters and an artillery observer. When the Americans began their offensive several hours later, the fire correction did not work because the coordinates had not been transmitted in time. This allowed the tank column to bypass the firing sector and occupy a dominant height. Later, Perini, unaware of the full extent of the consequences, told the wine steward, "The wire cutters were old, I almost broke my teeth, but I cut it." The incident was recorded in a report as local unidentified interference. A single bend in the wire, which became an obstacle for a wheel, had a greater effect than reconnaissance or aviation. Sometimes victory in battle is achieved by a person whose job is to shape horseshoes. Fact 51. In 1966, Chinese physicist Liu Jin conducted an experiment involving the controlled heating of a graphite rod in a research reactor near Shanghai. The temperature sensor malfunctioned due to a manufacturing defect in one of the microchips, produced on old equipment using blueprints from the 30s. The measurement indicated overheating, although the actual temperature was within the normal range. Liu Jin promptly stopped the experiment. However, while analyzing this error, he conceived an idea for a new system. Instead of monitoring temperature, he proposed tracking changes in coolant density, which proved to be more reliable and predictable. This approach formed the basis for Chinese safety protocols for small reactors exported to Africa and Latin America. A single micro-failure caused by faulty soldering ended the experiment but initiated a chain of events that led to the growth of the export atomic industry. The erroneous number proved more useful than the correct one. Fact 52nd. In 1922, in Bucharest, robbers stole from a mail train, taking bags of money and letters. Among the letters was a sealed envelope with a complaint against an official, submitted by a simple peasant. The complaint was intended to remain unanswered, lost in the archives. However, after the theft, some letters were found in the suburbs, scattered across a field, and accidentally read at a local police station. The content of the letter was so vivid and direct that the official mentioned in it was immediately summoned to the prosecutor's office. This became the first publicly disclosed anti-corruption case in post-war Romania. The original letter was included in the court record as a document recovered after unauthorized opening. The irony is that if the bag with complaints had not been stolen, no consequences would have followed. Sometimes justice comes not through legal channels, but along the rails of a mail train, intercepted on the right night. Fact 53rd.
During the assault on Berlin in 1945, a Red Army battalion encountered a building marked on maps as a museum. The decision was made to bypass it, considering it a non-military site. However, a random shot from the roof compelled the soldiers to enter. Inside, they discovered an SS underground printing press that produced fake documents for officers to escape under assumed names. Hundreds of prepared passports were seized, some with photos already affixed. The discovery was handed over to counterintelligence, and these materials enabled the arrest of dozens of Nazis attempting to hide. The forged identity papers became evidence. The soldiers later commented that they hadn't intended to go in, stating, "And there weren't any proper doors either." A single bullet fired from the roof acted as a click on the mask of deceit. Without it, dozens of people would have vanished into the post-war chaos, living under false names and biographies.
Fact 54th. In 1888, in London, during the panic caused by the Jack the Ripper murders, the police received an anonymous letter detailing a future attack. The letter appeared to be a prank. The paper was cheap, the handwriting was uncertain, and the date was mixed up. It was placed in the false alarms pile. But 3 days later, exactly what was described happened. The location, the weapon, and even the mention of a red scarf on the victim's neck matched. In a panic, an official who read the letter tore it from the folder and tried to get rid of it, but at that moment, a photographer entered, taking pictures of correspondence for the archive. The image was preserved and became part of the investigation. This snapshot became the first clue in the attempt to establish the handwriting and possible author. The paradox: the original was destroyed, but a copy, made by chance, became one of the main documents. The chance was hanging by a thread and depended on whether the technician entered the room 5 minutes earlier or later. Fact 55th. In 1822 year, the Congress of the Holy Alliance took place in Vienna. At this Congress, European powers attempted to establish the rules for the continent's post-war order. One of the protocols, concerning the status of Sardinia and navigation rights in the Adriatic Sea, was printed with an error. The French word droit, rights, was mistakenly replaced by the typographer with droit, right, in the singular. This nuance was not captured in the Russian translation, and the text acquired a completely different meaning, as if it referred to a privilege granted to one state. The Russian delegation, led by Nesselrode, insisted on including this version in the archives. 5 years later, when Austria contested these rules, this very point became a trump card in diplomatic negotiations. The error in number, caused by the typesetter's fatigue after 3 consecutive night shifts, cemented a legal formula that would affect access to ports for almost 3 decades. Sometimes the plural form is already politics. Fact 56th. In 1908, at the Renault factory in Billancourt, a worker mistakenly installed a carburetor on the opposite side of the engine. This led to the creation of a model that unexpectedly showed improved dynamics during a test drive. Initially, the designers intended to classify the car as defective, but the test driver insisted on a repeat. This is how the layout was born, which later formed the basis for the first mass-produced rear-engined car in Europe, the Renault 4CV. This model would become a symbol of France's post-war recovery. The technical incident report stated, unauthorized rearrangement of components occurred without engineer approval. What was considered a violation turned out to be a discovery. The assembly line error, a result of haste, heat, and an unclear drawing, gave rise to a new direction in automotive engineering. Thus, the phrase "engine in the back" moved from the incident log to a bestseller on wheels. Fact 57th. In January of the year 1909, during the visit of German Kaiser Wilhelm II to Istanbul, the ceiling in one of the reception halls of the Sultan's palace collapsed. The cause was not negligence, but accidental overload. During cleaning, a heavy flower basket, a gift from the German delegation, was hung from the crystal chandelier. When the chandelier broke, no one was injured. Only the negotiations were postponed for a day.
However, this unforeseen event provided an opportunity for one of the Turkish ministers, Halil Bey, to meet the Kaiser informally in the palace library. It was there that the project for the Berlin-Baghdad Railway was first mentioned, which would later become the subject of years of disputes and the key to regional influence. One basket, hung for beauty, broke the ceiling and opened a negotiation ceiling. Sometimes diplomacy happens not at the table, but at a library globe, at the moment when a cleaner simply misjudged the weight of a bouquet. Fact 58. In 1964, at a military testing ground near Kuyibshev, exercises were conducted using new surface-to-surface missiles. During preparation, one of the radio operators mistakenly entered the launch code on a frequency reserved for a training signal. As a result, the missile actually launched, but to default coordinates, a spot in the steppe next to an empty water tower. The impact was precise, and no damage occurred. However, while investigating the cause, engineers discovered that this specific zero code bypassed self-destruct system failures and could be used for manual correction. Based on these observations, a backup guidance algorithm for a silent launch was developed. It would later become part of the rapid response protocol. The missile, launched due to a mistaken key press, brought an idea instead of a scandal. One incorrect impulse in the radio cipher became the foundation for the reliability of the next generation of weaponry. Fact 59th. In 1905, at the Japanese port of Shimonoseki, during the signing of a peace treaty following the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian delegation's translator, Alexei Krivtsov, made an error in interpreting the phrase perpetual access. He translated it as the possibility when necessary, which significantly softened the legal wording regarding Russia's rights to use the railway in southern Manchuria. The Japanese side, noticing the substitution, did not argue and instead secured a more advantageous version in the final text. Krivtsov's mistake was identified only in St. Petersburg, but the signed treaty was not revised. Subsequently, this became one of the arguments for the complete withdrawal of Russian economic missions from the region. The phrase, translated too softly, possibly out of a desire not to escalate the situation in the negotiation room, resulted in the loss of an entire transport corridor. One nuance in language and a vital railway line disappears from the empire's map. Fact 60. In 1934, in a Belgrade laboratory, a young assistant named Jovanovic questioned the results of experiments concerning bacteriophages. During a test, he accidentally used water from an old vial containing a chlorinated mixture, which, by all accounts, should have destroyed the microorganisms. However, the phages survived and remained active. This outcome was considered an error, but the assistant preserved the sample and sent it to Paris, where it attracted the attention of microbiologists at the Pasteur Institute. It was there that it was discovered that this was a previously unknown form of a resistant viral agent capable of surviving aggressive environments. This marked the beginning of a new line of research, leading to the creation of the first prototypes of phage therapy for resistant infections. It all started when a lab technician ran out of distilled water and used the first flask of bleach he found. A safety error turned into a foundation for an alternative to antibiotics. Fact 61. In 1928, during the preparation of the exhibition Contemporary Art of Eastern Europe in New York, staff at the Metropolitan Museum mistakenly included canvases by avant-garde artist Isaac Rabinovich in the catalog, believing his works to be from the Lithuanian school. In reality, Rabinovich lived and worked in Kharkiv and was a representative of Ukrainian constructivism. This mix-up became an accidental advertising campaign. After the exhibition, his paintings began to be actively acquired by collectors, and the artist himself received invitations to London and Paris. Later, Rabinovich would become one of those who laid the foundations for the design curriculum in the USSR, drawing on his European recognition. A single catalog with a geographical error opened the Western market for the artist and presented the country with its first officially recognized modernist. The museum later joked, We discovered a new artist while looking for an old school. Fact 62nd. During Fidel Castro's visit to the USSR in 1963, he was offered a tour of VDNK during a break between meetings. The route was planned at the last minute, and his escort accidentally led him not to the Cuba pavilion, but to a hall showcasing the latest Soviet refrigerators and freezers. Castro, impressed by the product's storage technologies, requested a private demonstration. This episode became the starting point for a contract to supply Soviet household appliances to Cuba, which in turn generated a series of barter agreements, sugar in exchange for electronics and refrigeration equipment. An accidental turn in a long VDNK corridor initiated exports that were not even discussed in the original agenda. This episode is sometimes referred to in history as the Cold Turn, and it's not just about the climate. Fact 63rd. In 1942, an air raid alarm sounded in Los Angeles as radars detected unidentified targets over the coast. For several hours, sirens wailed over the city. Anti-aircraft guns opened suppressive fire, and searchlights scanned the sky. The city's residents, in panic, awaited a Japanese bombing. There were no enemy aircraft in the sky. It was later discovered that the cause was a radar reflection from a weather balloon, accidentally launched from a meteorological service base. The balloon was lifted by the night breeze, not by the operator on the designated day. The balloon itself was tied to a training launch and stored on the station's balcony. According to all regulations, it should have been lowered, but a technician, too lazy to go down to the storage, left the balloon secured only by its lower loop. The wind tore the fastening, resulting in the Battle of Los Angeles, the largest air combat of World War II, where the adversary turned out to be a rubber bag filled with helium. 300 shells were fired, 3 people were injured, and 1 street lamp was destroyed. Fact 64th. In 1899, a French pharmacy in Arles made a mistake with an ingredient delivery. Instead of camphor decoction, the box contained cinchona bark extract, which has a distinctly bitter taste. The local pharmacist, rather than returning the product, decided to save money and use it in tonic production. One of these drinks, with added orange juice and vermouth, caught the attention of a cafe owner. This led to the creation of the first cocktail recipe, later named Americano. Years later, the legendary Negroni would be developed based on it. An incorrect box with the wrong extract, the apothecary's stinginess, and one imaginative bartender gave rise to an entire aperitif culture. A recipe that could have ended up on a discounted shelf became a hallmark of European bars. A wrong invoice birthed a taste that has endured for 3 centuries. Fact 65th. In January 1916, French sappers were tunneling under Verdun. One worker, miscalculating, directed the shaft slightly north of the planned route. This displeased the engineers, but there was no time to correct it as a German offensive was imminent. Consequently, instead of the main evacuation tunnel, an additional exit was created, leading towards a slope considered unpromising. 2 months later, this exit proved to be the only open escape route when German artillery destroyed all other communications. It is believed this error saved up to 2,000 lives. The report on the incident was titled "Deviation of 38 Paces." This very shift, caused by a worn-out theodolite and the digger's fatigue, became a corridor of life. Sometimes salvation is simply not where it was planned, nor when it was desired. Fact 66th. In 1931, in New York, architect Raymond Hood designed the spire for the Chrysler Building. It was intended to be installed secretly so that the building would exceed its competitor, the Bank of Manhattan Trust Building, by several meters. However, during the crane installation, a mechanic made a miscalculation in the counterweight, causing the structure to shift 7 degrees during its ascent. To rectify the situation, workers reinforced the central fastening, altering the spire's shape. This gave the tower a unique curve and an elongated sharpness that would later become its signature silhouette. Critics later wrote about its magnificent aerodynamics, although it arose by chance from the fear of dropping the metal dome onto 47th Street. Thus, a technical error gave birth to one of the most recognizable silhouettes of the 20th century. The shape was not calculated. It was saved. Fact 67th. In 1909, in Budapest, at the Municipal Printing House, a mistake occurred during the printing of a social democratic campaign bulletin. The typecases were mixed up, and instead of the slogan, Elore o sabotariert, forward for freedom, the title read, Elore o saboert, forward for the tailor. The publisher, in a panic, ordered the withdrawal of the print run, but 100 copies had already been distributed in the workers' district. The phrase seemed comical and relatable. It immediately became the subject of jokes, began to be quoted, and turned into a local meme. Surprisingly, in the same district, a worker from a clothing sewing cooperative was soon elected to the board of directors, and the slogan accidentally formed the basis of the election campaign. Newspapers wrote, "Now both freedom and the tailor go together." Decades later, the phrase would be included in collections of Hungarian street folklore. One typesetter, by mixing up two cases of letters, did more to popularize the slogan than the entire party school. Fact 68th. In 1948, when Israel's first diplomatic courier was sent from Tel Aviv to Moscow, the embassy mail mistakenly went not to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but to the Foreign Intelligence Archive. The reason was a glitch in the new sorting system at Sheremetyevo Airport. The form was filled out in German, and an OCR, optical character recognition machine, sent the bag to a compartment marked Geheimdienst. The mail lay in a closed room for 2 days. One of the lieutenants, named Samsonov, while examining the outer packaging, discovered a strange handwritten note among the markings, evidence of connection with the USA. It turned out to be an internal note from an Israeli employee concerning economic reports on post-war aid. From that moment, the systematic development of a spy network in Israel began. One automatic sorter, one extra line on the wrapper, and the wrong door, and an intelligence line spanning half a century emerged. Fact 69th. In 1932, a toy factory in Czechoslovakia decided to sell off old-model dolls that had been in stock. To make them more lifelike, they were fitted with a built-in squeaker, an element from dog toys that had been mistakenly delivered. The sound produced was sharp, shrill, and resembled a cry. Children did not like it, but something entirely different caught attention. One educator, after buying a doll, observed that a child reacted to the sound faster than to regular commands. Soon, the squeaker began to be used for hearing correction in children with hearing impairments, and later as a standard signal in pediatric hearing tests. Production was reoriented, and the former doll squeakers became a medical instrument. What was initially considered a marketing failure turned into a diagnostic tool. The mistaken batch of toys stopped being amusing, but started to be heard. Fact 70th. In 1960, during a live broadcast of Nikita Khrushchev's visit to an aviation plant in Novosibirsk, the operator accidentally pressed the zoom pedal when the camera was not focused on the speaker but on the conveyor belt. The frame that went on air showed a board with a production schedule prominently displaying the inscription, "Failure to meet deadlines is inevitable." Observing the broadcast in the Kremlin, they demanded explanations. The plant was called in for an inspection, which uncovered a whole network of falsified records, bonus manipulations, and fictitious reports on product delivery. The management was replaced, and the scheme revealed by the accidental broadcast became the basis for creating a real accounting system in industrial enterprises, a prototype for future control automation. One wrong frame, one focus on a background object, and the television lens becomes a mirror of truth. The camera made a mistake, but the truth was captured. Fact 71. In 1946, in Vienna, within the premises of a former school that temporarily housed the Allied headquarters, a wire for the interfloor public address system broke. A technician sent for repairs mistakenly connected an external reception line instead of the communication cable. Consequently, the internal conversation of British officers began to be broadcast over the radio linked to a field radio channel. The discussion in the air covered Great Britain's intentions to postpone the withdrawal of its troops from parts of the occupied zones, which also involved France and the United States. Soviet radio operators tuned to this channel recorded the conversation. The information was instantly sent to Moscow, where it was met with a series of firm diplomatic notes. The planned agreement on the coordination of post-war administration of Austria fell through. One incorrectly inserted plug into an old distribution block put an end to the plan for multilateral control. Sometimes major politics breaks down in the very same places where children once learned Morse code. Fact 72nd. In 1998, during the restoration of paintings at the Louvre, Georges de la Tour's painting, The Card Players, was temporarily moved to another hall. The responsible curator mistakenly entered the old inventory number, and the painting was placed in the French Baroque folklore section, alongside lesser-known works from provincial collections. A chance visit to this hall by the renowned director Bernard Tavernier led to an unexpected turn. He was inspired by the painting's composition and lighting and decided to include its image in his film, The Judge and the Killer. Subsequently, the cinematography in the film was recognized as one of the best in French cinema of the 70s. De la Tour's painting was rediscovered and elevated in status to a museum masterpiece. One misplaced number in the transfer document turned a dark corner into a point of inspiration, and a film frame emerged from someone accidentally hanging a hook 2 meters further. Fact 73rd. In 1935, during the construction of the first line of the Moscow Metro, drilling foreman Frol Mashenko misinterpreted an engineer's instruction. Instead of deepening the tunnel by 1.5 meters on the section between the Smolenskaya and Arbitskaya stations, he began to raise the arch. As a result, the section ended up with an unusually high ceiling, creating a dome-like acoustic effect. Although the mistake was noticed soon after, it was not corrected because deadlines were pressing. 10 years later, this very section would be used to test a new type of underground communication, as echo signals traveled particularly clearly here. Later, the public address system in the metro was built on this principle. Mashenko's error was incorporated into training as an example of unintentional useful curvature. The metro, built with an inaccuracy, turned out to be an ideal laboratory, precisely because someone confused up and down in an oral instruction amidst the roar of jackhammers. Fact 74th. In 1941, as Japan prepared its strike on Pearl Harbor, Imperial Navy cryptographers utilized a special code table named Purple 97. A day before the attack, in Tokyo, at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, one official misordered the transmission of a portion of a dispatch. Consequently, the message announcing the severance of diplomatic relations with the USA was sent in 2 stages, out of sequence. This caused confusion in Washington. The dispatch received on the morning of December 7th did not include the key phrase about ending negotiations. American intelligence, having intercepted and deciphered the telegram, did not perceive it as an attack signal due to the mix-up. The extra time benefited the Japanese side. Historians still debate whether this glitch was accidental or intentional. However, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs archives contain a draft of the original message with a red pencil notation, Junjo, meaning order. This doubt, left in the margins, became an invisible marker for the start of the war. Fact 75th. In 1960, during the Olympic Games in Rome, a technical error occurred during the award ceremony for the Polish runner Elżbieta Kresińska. The person responsible for the sound recordings mixed up the tapes and, instead of the Polish national anthem, played a recording from a local concert. A popular romance set to Vivaldi's music was broadcast. There was a pause, confusion, and subdued applause. It all appeared as a minor misunderstanding. However, in the athlete's homeland, this incident caused a strong reaction. State newspapers called what happened a display of arrogance by the organizers. Yet, among the youth, the recording circulated as a popular radio signal, becoming the unofficial anthem of sport. A year later, composer Władysław Szpilman wrote a march on the same theme, which would later become the musical intro for Polish television. An error with the player and a forgotten tape label gave rise to a melody that would later accompany broadcasts of Olympic victories. Fact 76. In the year 1864, at an arms factory in Châtellerault, France, a foundry worker named Jules Renault mistakenly used an old mold intended for muskets of the 36th year's model. This resulted in a non-standard part with an unusual chamber for gunpowder. An experimental engineer, not understanding its purpose, tried inserting a primer cap into it and noticed that ignition was faster and cleaner. This served as the impetus for creating a new model of percussion primer, which would later be adapted into the design of the French chassepot rifle. The technology would spread across Europe and reach Russia, where it would be applied in hunting firearms. One forgotten template, cast in haste during an evening shift, turned out to be an innovation. Renault later stated that he intended to report the defect but overslept the morning report. Fatigue, an old template, and a bit of gunpowder transformed a factory error into an export technology. Fact 77th. In 1937, in Leningrad, during the filming of a movie about the revolution, a lighting technician failed to handle the load and accidentally directed a powerful spotlight not into the frame, but through a window across the street, illuminating the corner of an abandoned warehouse. Filming was stopped, the lamp had to be cooled. But the operator's attention was drawn to silhouettes in the warehouse. Figures were moving among the crates. The police were called. It turned out the building was used by an underground group trading in captured weapons. 8 people were arrested, 24 rifles and a rare pistol from the Civil War era were seized. Leningradskaya Pravda wrote about this incident, mentioning the vigilance of Soviet cinema. The lighting technician himself said in an interview, "I just missed. I didn't screw in the lens." The miss became a spotlight for the investigation. One beam, going the wrong way, highlighted what had been hidden in the shadows for 10 years. Fact 78. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, amidst intense negotiations, the phone rang in the Oval Office of the White House. It wasn't the direct line to the Pentagon, but a regular internal extension. The call came from the secretary of Vice President Lyndon Johnson. She had dialed the wrong number while trying to order coffee for an evening meeting. Those present froze for a moment as the call occurred while they were discussing the response to a potential nuclear strike. John F. Kennedy, upon hearing the woman's voice on the line, simply laughed and said, "It seems we still have time for coffee." The tension eased, and at that moment, he decided to postpone the retaliatory action by 4 hours. It was during these hours that information arrived about the Soviet Union softening its stance. A secretary's mistake, a pressed button, and an unissued order. Sometimes, between war and negotiations, lies a phone call asking, "With sugar?" Fact 79th. In 1832, in Berlin, at a meeting of the Royal Academy of Sciences, mathematician Peter Dirichlet refused to deliver his prepared lecture on number theory. The reason was a morning cold that left him with a hoarse voice. Instead, to avoid leaving entirely, he briefly outlined a sketch of another, as yet unpublished idea, a principle that would later be called the Dirichlet principle or the pigeonhole principle. The idea was simple. If there are fewer places than items, something must coincide. A student named Carl Stein, who attended the lecture, wrote down these considerations and circulated them among a circle of young mathematicians. Decades later, this principle would become a foundation in cryptography, probability theory, and combinatorics. It all began because the professor could not speak for more than 10 minutes. One lost voice on a rainy day transformed a common observation into a fundamental tool. The lecture that almost didn't happen turned out to be the most fruitful. Fact 80. In 1909, on a Russian vessel sailing from Vladivostok to Nagasaki, mechanic Nikolai Shaposhnikov decided to make tea in the engine room. He placed the kettle near the oil supply opening, causing steam to accidentally enter the cooling mechanism. The temperature contrast led to a sudden compression of the fuel supply pipe, and the engine stopped. The vessel began to drift. The next day, while awaiting repairs, the crew noticed unusual fish aggregations in the area and began fishing. It turned out that the ship was located above a ridge where tuna schools were concentrated, previously undescribed by anyone. This spot would later become a strategically important fishing area, and it was by the coordinates from that vessel that the first map of fishing windows on the East Coast would be compiled. One kettle, one puff of steam, one emergency stop, and the entire fish economy shifts 100 kilometers south. The captain later said, "Shaposhnikov put the tea in the wrong place again, and thank God." Fact 81. In 1922 in Paris, at the moment Marcel Proust was dictating another page of In Search of Lost Time, his secretary Jacques Arnaud was distracted by a noise in the hallway and mixed up two sentences. As a result, a phrase appeared in the draft that Proust had not uttered, and the scent was not insistent but insinuating. The writer, after rereading, said, "I wouldn't have said it like that, but it's better." The phrase remained. Later, literary critics would call this turn of phrase Proust's insinuating turn and consider it the pinnacle of the author's style. Arnaud admitted in his memoirs that he simply hadn't heard the word. He returned to the line belatedly. One noise outside the door, one lost second, and the writer's intonation changed. An error that merged with the intention and became part of it. Great style is sometimes born not from intention, but from the pause between two knocks. Fact 82nd. In 1954, in a Chicago laboratory focused on synthesizing new plastics, a lab technician named Andrew Carter used a faulty thermometer. The mercury column inside it consistently malfunctioned. Due to incorrect temperature measurement, the reaction's temperature was underestimated, leading the chemist to stop the experiment, deeming it unsuccessful. However, it was later discovered that under this unsuccessful condition, a new compound formed in the test tube, polytetrafluoroethylene, more commonly known as Teflon. The material proved to be heat-resistant, chemically inert, and ideal for coating frying pans and rocket parts. Carter received an award, and the broken thermometer was placed in the factory's museum. When asked why he didn't check the temperature, he replied, "Who would have thought an error was the formula?" One glitch gave birth to a surface to which nothing, not even fate, sticks. Fact 83rd. In 1970, the Indian government ordered a batch of school maps. These maps were intended to show national borders strictly in line with New Delhi's position without disputed regions. However, a printing house in Calcutta, upon receiving the design, accidentally used an old British matrix. This matrix depicted the border with China along a line favorable to Beijing. Over 1 million copies were distributed to schools before the Ministry of Education raised an alarm. Significantly, one of these posters was captured on camera during a Chinese television report. Following this, Beijing announced, "India recognizes the territory as ours." Despite subsequent denials, this incident became a propaganda asset and was included in Chinese textbooks as unofficial recognition. The map, mistakenly printed due to an outdated template and the editor's time constraints, became an argument in the dispute between two nuclear powers. A single stamp on an offset press on a hot day caused diplomacy to break along the fold line. Fact 84th. In 1895, in London, a construction crew laying a sewer in the Whitechapel area uncovered old brickwork. Behind it, they found several paper rolls burnt at the edges. The foreman intended to hand the find over to the archive. However, upon not finding a museum worker present, he left the papers in the site's tea room. There, a stoker accidentally used them as kindling. One of the rolls, which was nevertheless preserved, would later be deciphered. It turned out to be the diary of a police inspector, mentioning the name of a suspected individual in the Jack the Ripper case, a Polish barber from Dorset Street. It was a passing mention without details, but included a note about an interrogation. This entry became one of the few indirect clues that historians would later take seriously. The irony is that an hour before this, another roll mentioning the same address burned in an ash can. One kettle, one log, one urgent cleanup. History once again remained unanswered, but a random corner of ink survived.
Fact 85th. In 1926, when a poster for the screening of Battleship Potemkin was being prepared in Berlin, a typesetter mistakenly inserted "Murder of the People" instead of the scene title, "Murder of the Sailor." The error appeared as an effective propaganda metaphor, and the organizers decided not to correct it, thinking it was even more impactful. Anti-fascist groups immediately became interested in this slogan, and it was copied onto leaflets, posters, and banners. A year later, Bertolt Brecht used the same phrase in one of his essays on the role of cinema in revolution. The typesetting error generated rhetoric that would later become part of the arsenal of European anti-authoritarian culture. One typesetter, rushing to finish his shift, missed a letter, launching a slogan that survived into the political theaters of the late 20th century. In textbooks, this is called a production metaphor. In reality, it was a random letter that was not removed in time.
Fact 86th. In 1980, in Sierra Leone, a Canadian engineer named Walter Mason was installing a radio tower. Due to an error in voltage calculation, the device malfunctioned and emitted a powerful radio signal. This signal was accidentally detected by students from Ghana Technical University who were experimenting with homemade equipment. The signal confused them because it matched frequencies where no transmissions were supposed to occur. The students began investigating further, and one of them, Akufo Dadzi, noticed that the signal passed perfectly through an area considered a radio shadow. This discovery would later lead to the development of the first inexpensive method for relaying signals in African villages with uneven terrain. Local communications, including emergency contact and school radio, would emerge because one tower broke down and someone did not turn off a receiver. A random failure became the blueprint for an entire system. Fact 87th. In 1901, at the Phoenix sewing machine factory in Riga, a 14-year-old apprentice turner named Yanis Lachis, during a night shift, mixed up the dimensions of parts. Instead of a standard bobbin carriage, he machined a modified one with a recess. The foreman decided to test how this new shape affected thread tension, rather than classifying it as defective. It turned out that the new design allowed for the use of thinner and more elastic threads without breakage. The item was not put into mass production, but the diagram remained in the workshop notebook. A year later, an engineer at the St. Petersburg Machinery Exhibition noticed the drawing and incorporated it into a project for creating Fourier's machines, which were needed for the mass production of gymnasticas during World War I. Thus, a part that originated from a student's mistake became a standard for army uniforms. Lachis later became an engineer, but even then, his incorrectly measured dimension became part of the front supply system. Fact 88th. In 1974, in Los Angeles, during preparations for a Frank Zappa concert, a lighting technician made a programming error. They activated bright stage lighting at the moment of rehearsal, even though the lighting plan called for complete darkness. The sudden intense illumination of the audience area, where city council members were observing the rehearsal to assess compliance with moral standards, caused them to leave the venue blinded and embarrassed. The concert was approved, as no obvious violations were found. This accidental burst of light, caused by a faulty dimmer program, allowed the musicians to perform in their original format without any censorship. Later, Zappa incorporated this same technical approach, illuminating the audience rather than the stage, into his shows as a symbol of open dialogue. One button pressed in the dark, and the control system was momentarily blinded. Fact 89th.
In 1949, during the initial months of the Berlin airlifts operation, American pilot Gail Halvorson mistakenly dropped a bag of provisions onto the wrong site. Instead of the supply headquarters, it landed at a school where children had gathered. To smooth over the awkwardness, he attached candies to the next package, using handkerchiefs as parachutes. The idea was well received, and the children began waving handkerchiefs at him from the ground. The headquarters received letters of thanks, and the Army permitted the continuation. Thus, Operation Candy Bomber was born, an entire humanitarian initiative that became a symbol of goodwill during the Cold War. It all began with the pilot miscalculating the trajectory and visually determining where to land. One navigation error, and instead of a government warehouse, a gift landed directly into childhood. The candies, tangled in handkerchiefs, melted not only the ice, but also the concrete of ideologies. Fact 90. In 1925, in Moscow, during the recording of Leon Trotsky's speech for the Party Archive, the sound engineer accidentally pressed the rehearsal playback button without starting the actual recording. The first 10 minutes of his speech were lost. The speech was emotional and vivid, but the same effect could not be achieved on the second take. As a result, the preserved version turned out to be lackluster, and the transcript did not make an impression. The Central Committee compared the draft with the recorded text and decided that Trotsky had lost his sharpness. This influenced the assessment of his position in the power struggle. A year later, after his political defeat, the version with the muffled speech would be used as an weakened line. One technical failure, one incorrect setting, and the orator's anger vanishes into nothingness. Thus, the magic of the voice was turned off by the button of silence. Fact 91. In 1891, in Lyon, while laying a telephone line between two factories, electrician George Paquet stumbled upon a section where an unaccounted-for metal cable was already running underground. To avoid short-circuiting the line, he decided to route the wire along an alternative path, through the wall of the city archive. On this stretch, the signal proved exceptionally stable, despite its considerable length. Paquet became interested. The building was shielding against external interference. He recorded this observation in his report, and a few years later, his shielding formula would be used in constructing the first protected communication line between Paris and London. The mistakenly chosen route and the reluctance to dig an extra meter of trench gave rise to a technology indispensable in the worlds of espionage and diplomacy. Paquet would later say, "I simply didn't want to break the cobblestones," and ended up laying the foundation. Fact 92nd. In 1909 in Petersburg, at an evening of the World of Art Association, during the demonstration of a new slide projection of symbolist poetry, a mechanic accidentally inserted the slides in the reverse order. Instead of the intended sequence of darkness, flash, catharsis, scenes appeared on the screen in reverse motion, from light to darkness. Initially, this caused confusion. However, the poets, inspired by the effect, began to speak of a new turn of mystical form. One of the participants, a young Ossip Mandelstam, sketched a diagram of disappearing light in his notebook and later used it in the structure of his poem, Tristia. This error, caused by haste and the absence of labels on the boxes, influenced an entire generation of lyric poets. The slides, which were meant to lead to purification, moved towards obscurity, and it was this that generated the metaphor that became a literary dominant of the Silver Age. The distorted order became the order of a new feeling. Fact 93rd. In 1941, in Washington, during a meeting to establish a civil defense system, Colonel Walter Drake of the Technical Department presented an evacuation plan for a bombing scenario. He mistakenly used a map from the previous year, which listed a school in the city's southeastern sector as a warehouse. Consequently, the building was included in the instructions as unsuitable for civilian accommodation. A year later, during an air raid, a false alarm caused by drills, most of the evacuated individuals were directed to neighboring areas.
As it later turned out, the school building itself would have withstood the impact best due to its concrete floors, water reserves, and autonomous ventilation. This episode led to a review of civil protection principles and formed the basis for creating a classification of shelters by construction type rather than by purpose. One unsigned map, one forgotten seal in the archives, and the entire logic of security unfolds along a different trajectory. Fact 94th. In the year 1863, in Kiev, Julian Kulikovsky, a professor of Latin language, was delivering a lecture on the grammar of medieval texts. Mistaking the pages, he began to analyze an unfamiliar passage describing the process of paint-making instead of a treatise on declensions. He attempted to apologize, but the students, including future philologists, became curious about the origin of the fragment. Searches were initiated, and a year later, this text was identified as part of a lost recipe for Kiev blue, a vibrant pigment used in 11th century icon painting. This discovery spurred an entire school of study on church coloring, influenced restoration practices, and became a symbol of the Ukrainian bright tone. All this was due to a single fall of a stack of papers on the windowsill and an incorrect arrangement of folders. A random word, torn from its context, brought back the lost color to an entire era. Fact 95th. In 1960, in Alma-Ata, television center engineers were preparing equipment for the launch of the first broadcast across all of Kazakhstan. One of the installers, while checking the signal feed, accidentally activated a test screen. This screen featured an unconfirmed photo from the Baikonur Cosmodrome as its background. The image was broadcast for 10 seconds before the official start of the transmission. Although viewers only saw a blurred silhouette of a rocket against a desert backdrop, an investigation was launched by the Central Censorship Administration. Consequently, Moscow revised its publication procedures and approved an information lockdown policy until the successful launch. Thus, a random frame appearing on screen due to a tired technician became the trigger for a new information doctrine. From then on, space was not only a realm of achievements, but also a zone of absolute secrecy. The leak lasted less than 10 seconds, but it led to 2 decades of silence. Fact 96th. In 1898, at Harvard, during an anatomy lecture, a professor's assistant displayed a micrograph of skin affected by a rare type of dermatitis instead of the intended slide. The image was mistakenly identified as lung pleural tissue, but a student attending the class noticed structural differences. Her comment was initially deemed irrelevant, yet the professor later reviewed the materials and acknowledged, "The structure is indeed different." This observation formed the basis for a hypothesis on parallel cellular reactions in the skin and lung lining which, 20 years later, led to the development of the dermato-respiratory model for treating chronic inflammation. A slide error, an incorrectly labeled envelope, and one observant student, and a bridge is built between 2 medical disciplines. When the skin speaks for the lungs, it is sometimes only heard by the one who accidentally turned on the wrong projector. Fact 97th. In 1980, in the GDR, in the city of Erfurt, a radio factory experienced a shortage of Japanese parts for tape recorders. In an effort to save money, engineer Brunsman proposed using non-standard capacitors of local production, which produced a slightly muffled sound. One of the party officials, listening to a recording, noted, "Now it's like life, without that bourgeois brightness." The new standard was approved as more socially truthful, and from that moment on, all sound equipment in the GDR began to be produced with special filtering, under the brand Volksklang, People's Sound. It all started with the fact that the warehouse ran out of Japanese supplies, and what was available was used as a replacement. Thus, scarcity and a dislike for high-frequency peaks shaped the unique sound of socialist everyday life. The tonality of the era was sometimes born not in the studio, but in the supply department. Fact 98th. In 1928, in Rome, within a radioisotope laboratory, researcher Bruno Pontecorvo was gathering materials for an experiment involving uranium. One of the containers was not properly sealed and began emitting background heat. To avoid a burn, a technician placed a lead plate from another device, a radiography machine, between the container and the table. This element had been accidentally exposed, and Pontecorvo, after taking measurements, discovered that uranium interacted with it differently than under normal conditions. This led to the concept of pre-activating a material, which would later become a step towards the technology of artificial radioactivity induction. A storage error, heat from the container, and an unauthorized gasket between the devices served as the trigger for a new phase in nuclear physics. The radioactive push occurred not in an accelerator, but in the quiet of the laboratory, when someone burned their finger. Fact 99. In 1906, at Oxford's Bodleian Library, a misfiling occurred during archive digitization. Files of ancient Greek treatises were mixed with the catalogue of medieval alchemy. One student, studying Herophilus's work on the structure of the eye, opened a file with a Latin translation of recipes. Noticing familiar terms, he realized that alchemists had relied on medical descriptions of the vascular system. This sparked a wave of interest in comparing anatomical and mystical texts, eventually leading to the creation of the discipline History of Scientific Hermeneutics, a distinct field in the historiography of science. A database error, a misplaced folder label, and the curiosity of a student on a long vacation created a bridge between anatomy and alchemy that had not existed for 2 millennia. Rare insights, it turns out, happen not during dissertation defenses, but in the attempt to find the right PDF among hundreds of disordered ones. Fact 100. In 1960, at the Chess Olympiad in Leipzig, Soviet Grandmaster Viktor Korchnoi, on his way to a tournament game, got confused by the hall numbering. Instead of entering Sector C, he went into Sector E and accidentally found himself backstage where a meeting of FIDE representatives was taking place. He overheard a conversation discussing the possibility of limiting the number of participants from socialist bloc countries. This was a closed initiative and was not officially announced. Korchnoi relayed what he heard to his delegation, which prepared objections in advance, thus thwarting the initiative. Years later, this episode would become part of his distancing from the Soviet chess machine and later the reason for his emigration. One sign, incorrectly attached to a wardrobe door, one step aside, and a game that had not yet begun takes a different turn. It was a game of chess where the decisive factor was not the movement of a piece, but the path to the correct table.